There is a photograph that sits on the mantelpiece of the Hayes family home in the upscale suburbs of Connecticut. It is housed in a heavy, silver-plated frame, positioned perfectly between a crystal vase and an antique brass clock. In the photograph, Richard and Eleanor Hayes stand proudly on either side of their eldest daughter, Harper. They are smiling the kind of smiles reserved for holiday cards and country club newsletters. Teeth white, posture immaculate, exuding the effortless grace of people who believe they have done everything right. If you look very closely at the left side of the photograph, right near the edge of the silver frame, you will notice a slight crease in the glossy paper. It is a sharp, deliberate fold. Behind that fold, tucked out of sight and permanently hidden from the view of visiting neighbors and extended family, is the younger daughter, Clara. The Hayes family did not believe in unconditional love. They would never admit this out loud, of course. If asked, Eleanor would place a manicured hand over her heart and declare that her daughters were her entire world. But in the Hayes household, love was not a birthright. It was a currency. It was earned through achievements, secured by social status, and maintained by keeping up appearances. And 4 years ago, at the age of 28, Clara Hayes had gone bankrupt. It wasn't a reckless bankruptcy born of frivolous spending or bad habits. Clara had poured her life savings and a substantial business loan into a logistics startup. She had brilliant ideas but terrible timing and a naive trust in the wrong business partner. When the company collapsed, it didn't just fail. It imploded spectacularly, leaving Clara with a mountain of debt and nowhere to go but back to her childhood bedroom. She returned home seeking a safe harbor. What she found instead was a tribunal. The air in the house changed the day she moved her 3 cardboard boxes into the guest room. Richard, a retired corporate lawyer whose affection was entirely tied to success, stopped making eye contact with her. He would sit in his leather recliner, the Wall Street Journal held up like a shield, and offer only brief, monosyllabic grunts when she entered the room. Eleanor was worse. Eleanor's disappointment wasn't silent. It was a symphony of microaggressions played out in sighs, tightened lips, and thinly veiled remarks. "We just have to accept that not everyone is cut out for leadership, Richard," Eleanor said one evening, her voice carrying perfectly from the kitchen to the hallway where Clara stood frozen. "Some people are just meant to be followers. It's a shame about the money, though. It reflects so poorly." The contrast between the two sisters had never been starker. While Clara was drowning in legal paperwork and suffocating under the weight of her failure, 35-year-old Harper was ascending to the throne. Harper was the executive director of Apex Marketing, a prestigious firm in Manhattan. Harper wore tailored silk blouses that never wrinkled. Harper drove a sleek, obsidian black Mercedes. Harper was the daughter Richard and Eleanor could brag about at the country club luncheons. Every Sunday dinner became a masterclass in humiliation. Clara would sit at the far end of the long mahogany table, pushing her food around her plate, while the room revolved entirely around her sister. One particular Sunday in late November, the air was thick with the smell of roasted lamb and rosemary. Eleanor had brought out her best china, the plates with the delicate gold rim. Harper arrived 15 minutes late, breezing through the front door in a cloud of expensive citrus perfume, holding a bottle of wine that cost more than Clara's weekly grocery budget. "Sorry I'm late," Harper announced, kissing Richard on the cheek. "We just closed the Miller account. $3 million. The board is ecstatic." Richard beamed, his chest visibly puffing out. "That's my girl. I always knew you had the killer instinct, Harper. Pour your sister a glass of that, will you?" Harper took her seat, her eyes flicking toward Clara, who was wearing a faded gray sweater. A small, pitying smile played on Harper's lips. "Oh, actually, Clara," Harper said, reaching into her designer tote bag. "I brought you something. I saw it at the bookstore in the city and immediately thought of you." She slid a paperback book across the polished mahogany. Clara looked down. The title, printed in bright, cheerful letters, read, "Pennies to Prosperity, Budgeting Basics for the Financially Ruined." Silence hung over the table. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked. Clara felt a hot, prickling sensation rise in the back of her neck. She looked at her mother, hoping, just for a fraction of a second, to see a flash of defense, a mother's protective instinct. Instead, Eleanor was smiling gently, taking a sip of her ice water. "That's so thoughtful of you, Harper. You should really read it, Clara. It might give you some structure. Goodness knows you need a plan, instead of just sitting up in that room all day staring at your computer." I'm working, Mom, Clara said, her voice quiet, trying to keep the tremor out of it. I'm doing freelance coding, paying off the debt. Typing on a laptop isn't a career, Clara, Richard interjected smoothly, slicing his lamb. It's a distraction. You need to face reality. Maybe Harper could get you an entry-level position at Apex, answering phones, managing the mailroom, something to get you out of the house. I don't think she has the right temperament for our corporate culture, Dad, Harper said with a light laugh, picking up her wine glass. No offense, Clara. It's just very high pressure. Clara looked at the book. She looked at the gold-rimmed plate her mother had set for Harper, and then down at her own plate. A plain white ceramic dish with a small chip on the edge. It was a subtle demotion, a visual confirmation of her new status in the hierarchy. She wasn't family anymore. She was a cautionary tale, a charity case, a stain on the Hayes family legacy. The final fracture didn't happen with a screaming match. It happened with a notification. 2 weeks later, Clara was in the kitchen pouring a glass of water when she noticed Eleanor's iPad glowing on the counter. The screen was unlocked, open to a family group chat. The chat was named Hayes Family Vacation. Hey. Clara wasn't in it. She stood frozen in the dim light of the kitchen, reading the messages. They were planning a 2-week trip to Tuscany for the spring. Harper was booking the villas. Richard was researching wine tours. Eleanor, should we tell Clara we're going? Harper, honestly, Mom, why? She can't afford it, and it'll just make her depressed. Plus, I really need this trip to be stress-free. I don't want to spend 2 weeks walking on eggshells around her moods. Richard, Harper is right. Let's just say it's a business networking trip for Harper and we're tagging along. It's cleaner that way. Clara slowly backed away from the counter. The water in her glass trembled. She didn't cry. The pain was too dense, too solid for tears. It felt like a cold stone dropping into the pit of her stomach. She realized then that they didn't just view her as a failure. They viewed her as a burden. They were actively writing her out of their lives, editing her out of the picture, just like folding back the edge of a photograph. If she stayed, she would rot. She would spend the rest of her life apologizing for stumbling, begging for scraps of approval from a table where the seats were already taken. That night, while the house was completely silent, Clara packed her things. She didn't take much. 2 suitcases of clothes, her laptop, and a small box of essential files. She left the budgeting book on her neatly made bed. She didn't leave a note. Notes were for people who would be missed. Notes were for people who mattered. By 4 a.m., she was in her battered sedan driving onto the interstate, heading west. She had exactly $4,000 to her name, salvaged from months of grueling freelance work and a destination in mind. Seattle, a city where it rained often enough that no one noticed if you looked tired, a city built on tech, on second chances, on people who disappeared into the glow of a monitor. The drive took 5 days. When Clara finally arrived in Washington, she rented a cramped 1-room apartment above a noisy laundromat. The walls were paper thin, the heater rattled, and the only window looked out onto a brick alleyway. But to Clara, it was a fortress. She changed her phone number. She deleted her social media accounts. She cut the cord completely, severing the toxic tether that had dragged her down for 28 years. In that tiny, drafty room, fueled by cheap instant coffee and an anger that burned cold and steady in her chest, Clara went to work. She didn't have a social life. She didn't take weekends off. She sat in front of her laptop for 18 hours a day, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She wasn't building a simple logistics app this time. She was building something much bigger. She was taking everything she knew about data, consumer behavior, and the rapidly shifting landscape of artificial intelligence. And she was writing the architecture for a platform that could predict market trends faster and more accurately than any human team. She called the project Nexa. For the first 2 years, it was a brutal, isolating grind. There were nights when her bank account dipped below $50, nights when she ate plain rice and stared at the blinking cursor, wondering if she had lost her mind. But every time doubt crept in, she remembered the chip on the edge of her dinner plate. She remembered her mother's iPad glowing in the dark kitchen. She remembered the sound of her father's voice calling her a distraction. She wasn't just writing code. She was building armor. She was crafting a crown that no one could ever take away from her, precisely because they would never know she was wearing it. While the Hayes family continued their perfect, curated lives on the East Coast, Completely unaware and unbothered by her absence, Clara Hayes was quietly building an empire in the dark. And in the brutal, fast-paced world of digital marketing, where Harper Hayes felt she was untouchable, a storm was slowly gathering. A storm named Nexa. Time in Seattle did not pass in seasons for Clara Hayes. It passed in software versions. Version 1.0, version 1.2, version 2.0. She turned 30, then 31, then 32 inside that cramped, drafty apartment above the 24-hour laundromat. The relentless mechanical thumping of the industrial washing machines downstairs became the metronome to her existence. Her world shrank to the size of 3 glowing monitors arranged on a cheap, hollow-core door she used as a desk. The air in the room always smelled faintly of stale coffee, ozone from overworked cooling fans, and the damp chill that seeped through the poorly insulated window panes. To the outside world, Clara was a ghost. She had no LinkedIn profile, no Instagram, no digital footprint that could trace back to the disgraced daughter of Richard and Eleanor Hayes. When she needed groceries, she went at midnight. When she needed to communicate, she used encrypted emails and a rotating series of proxy servers. She was a woman who had meticulously erased herself to survive. But in the dark, she was building a leviathan. Nexa was no longer just an idea. It was a living, breathing architecture of code. Clara had identified the fatal flaw in the billion-dollar marketing industry that her sister Harper ruled over. Agencies like Apex Marketing relied on armies of analysts, bloated budgets, and the arrogant assumption that they could dictate what consumers wanted. They charged exorbitant fees to run campaigns based on outdated focus groups and human intuition clouded by ego. Clara designed Nexa to bypass the ego entirely. It was a proprietary artificial intelligence platform that didn't just analyze past consumer behavior. It anticipated future desires with terrifying precision. It could analyze millions of data points across global markets in a fraction of a second, identifying microtrends before they even had a name. It could generate, deploy, and optimize a marketing campaign across 100 platforms simultaneously, doing the work of a 50-person agency in 3 minutes for a fraction of the cost. It was a machine designed to make the Harpers of the world entirely and permanently obsolete. Yet for all her brilliant, ruthless focus, Clara still held on to a single, fragile thread connecting her to humanity. Not her family, they were a closed chapter, a wound she kept tightly bandaged. Her lifeline was a man named David Vance. 4 years ago, when Clara was 28, drowning in the public humiliation of her first bankruptcy and suffocating under her parents' contempt, David was the only person who hadn't looked at her like she was a contagion. David owned a boutique marketing agency in Portland called Lighthouse Media. It wasn't a massive, glittering corporate beast like Apex. It was a small firm of 40 fiercely loyal employees who handled accounts for local artisans, sustainable startups, and independent bookstores. When Clara's father had told her she was a distraction, meant for the mailroom, David had called her on the phone, his voice warm and gravelly. "I saw the news about your startup, Clara," David had said. "I'm sorry, it's a brutal market." Clara had braced herself for the pity, or worse, the lecture. "It was my fault. I miscalculated." "Failure is just data, kid," David had replied gently. "It doesn't define your intellect. It just informs your next iteration. I've got a backlog of messy back-end data that my team can't untangle. I need a brilliant mind to clean it up. Strictly freelance, under the table. You want the work?" David had thrown her a rope when she was actively drowning. The money from Lighthouse Media was what allowed her to buy the gas to drive to Seattle. It was the seed money that bought the servers stacked in her closet. Clara had never forgotten. She tracked Lighthouse Media's progress quietly, viewing them as a beacon of decency in an industry that celebrated ruthlessness. She had promised herself that the day Nexa went public and revolutionized the market, David Vance would be the first person she offered exclusive free access to the platform. But the corporate world does not reward decency. It cannibalizes it. It happened on a Tuesday in late October. The Seattle rain was lashing against the glass, blurring the neon signs of the street below. Clara was sitting on the floor, surrounded by a tangle of Ethernet cables, running a final diagnostic on Nexa's server arrays. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It wasn't a call. It was a Google alert she had set up years ago, a silent alarm programmed to notify her of any major movements regarding her family or Lighthouse Media. Clara stood up. wiping dust from her sweatpants, and clicked the notification on her center monitor. The screen flashed white, loading a press release from a major financial news outlet. The headline was written in the sterile, bloodless language of Wall Street. Apex Marketing executes strategic acquisition of Lighthouse Media. Harper Hayes announces expansion of Pacific Northwest portfolio. A cold spike of dread drove itself into Clara's chest. She leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light reflecting in her dark eyes. Beneath the headline was a high-resolution photograph of her sister. Harper was standing in the soaring glass atrium of the Apex headquarters in Manhattan. She wore a tailored crimson blazer, her hair blown out to perfection, her chin tilted upward in a pose of absolute, unassailable triumph. She looked exactly as she had at the Sunday dinner table 4 years ago, smug, flawless, and predatory. Clara scrolled past the photograph, her eyes scanning the blocks of text. The article framed it as a merger, a strategic move to absorb Lighthouse Media's specialized client list. But as Clara read the fine print, the ugly truth bled through the corporate jargon. It wasn't a merger. It was a hostile takeover. Apex hadn't bought Lighthouse because they valued the company's ethos or its people. They bought it because a rival mega agency had been eyeing Lighthouse's sustainable brand clients, and Harper wanted to block the move. It was a territorial flex, a game of chess played with real human lives. The next paragraph detailed the restructuring plan, spearheaded personally by Harper Hayes. Effective immediately, the Portland office of Lighthouse Media was to be dissolved. The assets were being liquidated, the client list was being absorbed into Apex's automated systems, and all 40 employees, including David Vance, were terminated, immediately, with no severance packages, citing a loophole in the acquisition contract that Harper's legal team had ruthlessly exploited. Clara stopped breathing. The silence in the apartment felt suddenly heavy, suffocating. She clicked on a linked article, a more informal industry blog, which featured a direct interview with Harper regarding the aggressive move. In today's hyper-competitive landscape, there is no room for sentimental business models, Harper was quoted as saying, her words dripping with the same condescension she used to reserve for Clara. Lighthouse was operating on a quaint, outdated philosophy of family-style business. But the market demands efficiency, not empathy. We are simply trimming the fat and streamlining for the future. Apex is not a charity. We are a machine. Clara stared at the quote, trimming the fat. That was how Harper viewed 40 people losing their livelihoods just before the holidays. That was how she viewed the man who had poured 20 years of his life into building a company with integrity. They weren't people to Harper. They were numbers on a spreadsheet, obstacles to be bulldozed to secure a slightly larger end-of-year bonus and a pat on the head from their father. Clara remembered the book Harper had given her, Pennies to Prosperity. She remembered her mother's voice echoing in the kitchen, casually discussing hiding Clara's existence from their vacation plans. They were a disease. The Hayes family operated on a toxic ideology that equated ruthlessness with worth and wealth with morality. They crushed anything that was vulnerable, anything that didn't serve their immediate vanity. And now, that disease had reached across the country and destroyed the one good thing Clara had left tying her to her past. A normal person might have cried. A normal person might have picked up the phone, broken years of silence, and screamed at their sister. Clara did neither. The heat behind her eyes didn't spill over into tears. Instead, it crystallized. The raw, desperate pain that had driven her out of Connecticut 4 years ago hardened into something entirely different. It turned into absolute, sub-zero clarity. She didn't pace the room. She didn't scream. She sat down slowly in her ergonomic chair, the only expensive piece of furniture in the apartment. She pulled the keyboard toward her. For 3 years, she had viewed Nexa as a shield, a way to build wealth quietly, to ensure she would never have to depend on anyone ever again. She had planned to keep it in beta testing for another 12 months, refining the user interface, slowly introducing it to independent contractors to build a quiet, steady revenue stream. She looked at her sister's face on the monitor. She looked at the crimson blazer, the perfect smile, the glittering arrogance of a woman who believed she was untouchable because the system was rigged in her favor. Apex is not a charity. We are a machine, Harper had said. You don't know what a machine is, Harper, Clara whispered to the empty room. Her voice was barely a rasp, dry and devoid of any warmth. Clara's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She opened the master command console for Nexa. Line after line of green text cascaded down the black screen, representing millions of interconnected nodes, algorithms, and predictive pathways waiting to be unleashed. She bypassed the beta testing protocols. She bypassed the safety limiters designed to throttle the AI's learning speed. She navigated to the deployment registry. She wasn't going to launch Nexa quietly to a few independent contractors anymore. She was going to drop it directly into the center of the global marketing grid. She was going to let the algorithm loose, allowing it to begin systematically analyzing, undercutting, and outperforming the bloated infrastructure of legacy agencies like Apex. She was going to commoditize the very thing Harper based her entire identity upon. Clara wasn't just hiding in the shadows anymore. She was stepping onto the battlefield. Her family had taught her that love was a transaction, and worth was measured in power. They had weaponized their success to make her feel small. Now she was going to use her intellect to completely dismantle their world. She typed a command into the terminal. Initiate _global_deployment_protocol_override. The system prompted her for an administrative password. The cursor blinked, waiting. Clara didn't hesitate. She typed in the password, a sequence of characters she had chosen 4 years ago on her first night in this dark apartment. It was the date she had left home, followed by the word invisible. She pressed the enter key. The hum of the servers in the closet suddenly pitched higher, a localized roar of raw computing power kicking into overdrive. On her 3 monitors, progress bars turned from yellow to solid green. Data packets began streaming outward, connecting to cloud nodes in Tokyo, London, Frankfurt, and New York. Nexa was live. Clara leaned back in her chair, the blue light washing over her pale, sharp features. She looked at the photograph of her sister one last time, then reached out and closed the browser window, plunging the screen back into the dark, infinitely complex world of her code. The game had officially changed. The Hayes family just didn't know it yet. 4 years is a long time in the physical world, but in the realm of technology, it is an entire epic. By the time Clara Hayes turned 32, the marketing landscape had been violently, irreversibly terraformed. Nexa was no longer a rogue program running on servers tucked inside a damp closet. It was the unseen gravitational force of the global market. Operating under a strict corporate veil with no public-facing executives, Nexa licensed its predictive AI to thousands of mid-level companies, allowing them to bypass legacy mega-agencies entirely. The old guard, agencies like Apex Marketing, were bleeding out. They were dinosaurs staring at the asteroid, unable to comprehend why their bloated multi-million-dollar ad campaigns were suddenly being outperformed by algorithms that cost a fraction of the price. Clara had moved out of the apartment above the laundromat. She now worked from a minimalist, light-flooded penthouse office in downtown Seattle. She wore tailored cashmere instead of faded sweatpants. Her bank accounts held numbers with commas that would have made her father weep, yet she remained a ghost. To the public, the CEO of Nexa was an anonymous entity. To her family, she was still the disgraced daughter who had run away to lick her wounds in obscurity. She hadn't spoken to Richard, Eleanor, or Harper in 48 months. Until the phone rang on a crisp Tuesday morning in early November. Clara was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a cup of black tea, watching the Seattle ferries cut through the steel-gray water of the Puget Sound. The caller ID on her secure private line flashed a Connecticut area code. Eleanor Hayes. Clara let it ring 4 times. The sound felt like a relic from a past life. Finally, she pressed the answer button. Hello? Clara? Oh, thank goodness. I wasn't sure if this number still worked. Eleanor's voice filtered through the speaker, dripping with a practiced, honeyed warmth that made Clara's spine instantly rigid. It's your mother, darling. I know, Clara said, her voice perfectly level. There was a slight pause on the line. Eleanor had clearly expected a warmer reception, or perhaps a nervous scramble for approval. Well, Eleanor continued, recovering smoothly, your father and I were talking, and we realized how terribly long it's been. We want you to come home for Thanksgiving this year. The whole family will be here. Clara took a slow sip of her tea. Thanksgiving. Yes, it'll be wonderful, Eleanor gushed, the pitch of her voice rising slightly. Harper is bringing the twins, of course. It's going to be quite a full house, which is lovely. But, well, Maria, our housekeeper, had a sudden family emergency and had to fly back to Guatemala, and Harper's nanny took the week off. It's just going to be so chaotic, and we thought, wouldn't it be nice to have Clara here? We could really use the family bonding time. Clara closed her eyes. We could really use the extra set of hands. It was breathtaking in its transparency. After 4 years of total silence, they weren't inviting a daughter home. They were importing unpaid labor. They needed someone to baste the turkey, scrub the fine china, and keep Harper's children entertained so the real adults could drink wine and network with their country club guests. A younger Clara would have hung up the phone, her heart shattered by the confirmation of her worthlessness in her mother's eyes. But the Clara standing in the penthouse merely smiled, a cold, sharp smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll be there," Clara said quietly. "Oh, wonderful," Eleanor breathed a sigh of genuine relief. "We'll see you Thursday morning, dear. Don't worry about bringing anything fancy." "I wouldn't dream of it," Clara thought as the line went dead. When Clara pulled her rented mid-range sedan into the sweeping circular driveway of the Hayes estate on Thanksgiving morning, it was as if time had stood perfectly still. The manicured lawns were free of fallen leaves. The brass knocker on the heavy oak door gleamed. She walked inside wearing the exact same faded gray sweater she had worn to that final humiliating Sunday dinner 4 years ago, paired with simple dark jeans and scuffed boots. It was her camouflage. She was slipping back into the role they had written for her. "Clara, you made it!" Eleanor greeted her in the grand foyer, wearing an immaculate silk blouse and a string of pearls. She offered a brief, one-armed hug that consisted entirely of air and expensive perfume. "Just drop your bag in the hall, dear. Could you run into the kitchen? The catering staff is hopelessly behind on the hors d'oeuvres, and the twins are running wild in the solarium." For the next 6 hours, Clara played the part of the docile failure flawlessly. While Richard entertained local politicians in the study and Eleanor hovered over the floral arrangements, Clara was relegated to the back rooms. She chopped vegetables, she folded linen napkins, she intervened when Harper's 6-year-old twins tried to color on the antique wallpaper. At 4 o'clock, the front door burst open and Harper arrived. She swept into the house like a localized weather event, wrapped in a camel hair coat, clutching a designer handbag and a sleek iPad. She looked older, the skin around her eyes pulled tight with exhaustion, but the arrogant tilt of her chin remained firmly in place. "I need a drink immediately," Harper announced to the foyer, thrusting her coat at Clara without really looking at her. The traffic on the Merritt Parkway was barbaric. "Harper, darling," Eleanor swooped in, "how are things at the agency?" "Brilliant," Harper said loudly, her voice echoing off the marble floors. Her eyes finally landed on Clara, holding her coat. A familiar, pitying smirk crossed her face. "Hello, Clara. Still wearing that sweater, I see. Glad you could make it to help Mom out." Clara calmly hung the coat in the closet. "Hello, Harper." Dinner was served at 7. The long mahogany table was set with the gold-rimmed china. The guest list included the Hayes family, a local judge, and the CEO of a regional bank. Clara was seated at the very end of the table, nearest the swinging door to the kitchen, right next to the twins. For the first 2 courses, the conversation flowed over Clara's head like water over a submerged rock. Richard held court, discussing golf handicaps and real estate. But as the main course, a massive, perfectly glazed turkey, was carved, Richard tapped his crystal wine glass with a silver fork. "If I may have everyone's attention," Richard boomed, his chest puffing with patriarchal pride. "We have a lot to be thankful for this year, but I am particularly thankful for the extraordinary resilience of my eldest daughter. Harper, why don't you share the news with the table?" All eyes turned to Harper. She took a slow, theatrical sip of her Cabernet, savoring the spotlight. "As some of you know," Harper began, her voice ringing with practiced corporate polish, "the marketing sector has been incredibly volatile. A lot of legacy agencies are folding. There's this new technology, an AI platform called Nexa. It's been aggressively undercutting the market, operating like a ghost. Nobody knows who built it, nobody knows who the founder is, but it's completely restructuring how global data is processed." Clara sat perfectly still at the end of the table, her hands resting in her lap. She watched Harper's face, studying the mixture of fear and awe in her sister's eyes when she spoke the name of the platform. "Apex was taking a hit," Harper admitted, feigning vulnerability for the sake of the narrative. "We were losing clients. The board was panicking. but I refused to let 20 years of brand equity go down the drain. So I took a risk, a massive one. Eleanor clasped her hands together, practically vibrating with pride. Tell them what you did, sweetie. I flew to San Francisco last week to meet with the proxy legal team representing Nexa, Harper said, her eyes gleaming. I negotiated an exclusive enterprise-level integration contract for the entire East Coast. It's a 10-year lock-in. It will give Apex an absolute monopoly over their predictive algorithms in this region. The bank's CEO at the table whistled low. That must have cost a fortune. I heard Nexa's enterprise tiers require liquid capital up front. Harper's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered smoothly. It did. We had to leverage every asset Apex owns. I took out a $50 million corporate loan, using the agency's headquarters and our entire client roster as collateral. It was a bloodbath to get the board to approve it. She leaned forward, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper that captivated the entire table. But we got it. The wire transfer cleared this morning. We are officially partnered with the biggest technological titan of the decade. We didn't just save Apex, we just bought the future. The table erupted into polite, wealthy applause. Richard raised his glass high. To Harper, the savior of Apex. Clara did not raise her glass. She watched her sister bask in the adulation, noting the desperate, manic edge to Harper's triumph. Harper had bet the house. She had literally mortgaged her entire company and her career on the assumption that Nexa would play ball. The most fascinating part, Harper continued, glowing under the praise, is the founder. They are completely fanatical about privacy. I've only communicated with them through their encrypted legal proxies. But this morning, after the funds cleared, I finally received a direct digitally signed welcome email from the CEO themselves. Harper reached down and picked up her iPad, tapping the screen to wake it. It's a masterclass in power, really. No phone calls, no meetings, just a signed document finalizing the transfer of power. Show us, Harper, Richard urged, leaning over. Let's see the signature of the ghost. Harper stood up, carrying the glowing iPad toward her father at the head of the table. She held it out like a sacred text. Read it and weep, Dad. Apex is back on top. Richard put on his reading glasses. The judge and the bank CEO leaned in, murmuring in anticipation. Eleanor smiled down at her plate, the picture of maternal fulfillment. At the far end of the table, Clara slowly reached out and picked up her wine glass. Richard squinted at the crisp, white screen. He read the brief, legally binding text acknowledging the receipt of the $50 million collateral lock-in. He scrolled down to the bottom of the document where the digital signature was affixed. Clara watched her father's face. She watched the exact moment his brain processed the letters on the screen. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing glitch in his reality. The jovial, flushed pride drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a sallow, ashen gray. His jaw went slack. The hand holding his reading glasses began to tremble, a fine, violent vibration that rattled the heavy gold ring on his pinky finger. Dad? Harper asked, a small frown line appearing between her perfectly manicured brows. What is it? Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. His vocal cords seemed to have paralyzed. He slowly looked up from the iPad, his eyes tracking the length of the long mahogany table, past the crystal centerpieces, past the roasted turkey, until his gaze locked onto the woman in the faded gray sweater sitting next to the kitchen door. Harper, irritated by the silence, snatched the iPad back. What are you looking at? She looked down at the screen, using her thumb and forefinger to zoom in on the cursive digital signature at the bottom of the page. The silence that followed was not just an absence of noise, it was a physical weight. It was the sound of a carefully constructed, arrogant reality collapsing in on itself in real time. On the glowing screen, in sharp, elegant black pixels, the name read, Clara Hayes, Chief Executive Officer and Founder, Nexa Corporation. Harper's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She stared at the screen, then at Clara, then back at the screen. The iPad slipped from her perfectly manicured fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor, cracking the glass. No one moved to pick it up. Eleanor, sensing the atmospheric pressure drop, looked frantically between her husband and her golden child. Richard? Harper? What's going on? Who is the founder? Clara took a slow, deliberate sip of her Cabernet. The wine tasted like ash, but she swallowed it anyway. She set the glass down on the white linen tablecloth. The soft clink of the crystal echoed like a gunshot in the silent dining room. She stood up. She didn't rush. She smoothed the wrinkles from her plain denim jeans. Every eye at the table was completely paralyzed, locked onto her. Harper looked like she was suffocating, her hands gripping the back of Richard's chair so tightly, her knuckles were white. Clara reached into the back pocket of her jeans. She pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, a cashier's check she had prepared that morning in Seattle. She walked slowly up the length of the table, the floorboards creaking softly beneath her scuffed boots. She stopped beside her mother's chair and placed the check gently next to Eleanor's gold-rimmed plate. "What is this?" Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling, though she still didn't understand the catastrophe that had just unfolded. "That is $2,000, Clara said, her voice carrying the calm, absolute authority of a judge handing down a sentence. "It covers the cost of my portion of the turkey, the wine, and standard holiday overtime rates for my babysitting services this afternoon. I don't like to leave debts unpaid." Clara turned her gaze to Harper. Her older sister was hyperventilating now, the terrifying reality setting in. Harper had just signed over the entire equity of Apex Marketing to the little sister she had publicly humiliated, isolated, and mocked. Harper was entirely, legally, at Clara's mercy. "Clara," Harper choked out, her voice a desperate, unrecognizable rasp. "Clara, please, the contract. You can't." "I reviewed your integration request personally, Harper," Clara said, her tone devoid of anger, devoid of vengeance. It was simply cold. It was the voice of the machine. "I also reviewed your recent business practices, specifically the hostile liquidation of Lighthouse Media in Portland and the termination of David Vance without severance." Harper flinched as if she had been struck. Richard let out a low, strangled sound. "Nexus terms of service are very clear," Clara continued, her eyes locking onto her sister's terrified face. "We maintain strict ethical standards for our enterprise partners. We do not do business with companies that exhibit predatory behavior, nor do we partner with leadership that lacks basic human integrity." Clara leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so only her family could hear the final, devastating blow. "The contract is voided, Harper. The collateral lock-in, however, is non-refundable per the terms you signed. You bet the house and you lost. Apex is done." Clara didn't wait for the screaming to start. She didn't stay to watch her father grasp his chest, or her mother burst into confused, hysterical tears, or her sister collapse into the ruins of her own hubris. She turned her back on the mahogany table, walked out the heavy oak front door, and stepped into the cool, biting November air. She got into her rented car, started the engine, and drove away from the estate, leaving the photograph on the mantelpiece permanently, irreparably shattered behind her. The bleeding of Apex Marketing began the morning after Thanksgiving. It wasn't a slow, dignified decline. It was an arterial spray. With the Nexa contract voided, the $50 million collateral loan Harper had taken out became an unmitigated catastrophe. Apex didn't just lack the funds to operate. They had handed over the legal rights to their headquarters and their top-tier client list to a holding company controlled by Clara. Panic swept through the Manhattan office. Senior partners resigned. Clients, smelling the blood in the water, began pulling their accounts. For the Hayes family, the illusion of control had shattered, replaced by a frantic, clawing desperation. 2 weeks later, the receptionist at the Seattle headquarters of Nexa Corporation buzzed Clara's private office line. "Hayes? I apologize for the interruption, but there are 2 people in the lobby demanding to see you. They're refusing to leave. They say they are your parents." Clara was reviewing code on her monitor. She didn't blink. "Send them up to conference room B. Leave the door open. Have security stand by the elevators." When Clara walked into the glass-walled conference room, Richard and Eleanor were pacing. They looked entirely out of place in the sleek, ultra-modern tech space. Richard's face was flushed, and Eleanor clutched her designer handbag like a life preserver. There was no warmth in their eyes. There was no apology for the 4 years of silence or the decades of conditional love. There was only the indignant rage of people who believed they were being robbed of something they owned. "Clara," Richard barked, stepping forward. He tried to project the commanding presence of the courtroom lawyer he used to be, but his voice was thin. "This has gone far enough. The little stunt you pulled at Thanksgiving was cruel, but we are willing to move past it. We need to talk business." Clara did not sit down. She stood by the door, her expression unreadable. "You have 3 minutes, Richard." Eleanor gasped at the use of his first name. "Clara, have some respect. We are your family." "You lost the right to use that word 4 years ago," Clara replied, her voice eerily calm. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Richard gritted his teeth. "Apex is going under. Harper is facing personal bankruptcy and the agency is defaulting on the loan. Now I know you're angry, but you cannot destroy your sister. We are a family, and family protects its own. I want you to reinstate the enterprise contract for Apex. Furthermore, you will transfer 30% of Nexa's equity to Harper to stabilize her board." It was a demand so breathtakingly audacious, so completely detached from reality that Clara almost laughed. They weren't there to make amends. They were there to collect a tax. 30%, Clara repeated softly. "It's the only way to save the family name," Richard insisted, taking a step closer, trying to use his physical size to intimidate her. "You owe us, Clara. The intelligence you used to build this machine. It came from my bloodline. We raised you. We provided for you. You are going to do the right thing and fix your sister's mess." Clara looked at her father. She looked at the man who had called her a distraction, and the woman who had hidden her existence from their vacation plans. "I don't owe you a single line of code," Clara said. Her voice didn't rise, but the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "You didn't raise me, you managed me. And when I stopped being a profitable asset to your social standing, you discarded me." Harper made a business decision to leverage her company. She signed the contract. She initiated the hostile takeover of Lighthouse Media. She dug the grave. I simply handed her the shovel. "You vindictive little," Eleanor hissed, her mask of maternal grace finally slipping, revealing the ugly, bitter truth underneath. "You were always the jealous one, always trying to ruin Harper's success because you couldn't handle your own failures." "Security," Clara said clearly. 2 large men in dark suits immediately stepped into the doorway. "Escort Mr. and Mrs. Hayes from the building," Clara instructed. "If they return, have them arrested for trespassing." "You can't do this," Richard yelled as the guard stepped forward. "We'll lose everything. Clara." Clara turned her back on them and walked out of the room. She felt no guilt. She felt only the clean, surgical precision of cutting out a tumor. But a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind, and Harper Hayes was entirely cornered. 3 days later, a smear campaign erupted across the tech and marketing blogs. Anonymous sources leaked the identity of the Nexa CEO, but it wasn't a story of triumph. It was a viciously fabricated hit piece. The articles detailed Clara's bankruptcy from 4 years prior, framing it not as a business failure, but as a massive fraud. Worse, the articles cited anonymous family sources claiming Clara was mentally unstable, deeply vindictive, and unfit to run a global AI platform. Harper was playing her last card. She couldn't beat Nexa's technology, so she tried to assassinate the character of its creator, hoping to scare off Nexa's investors and clients, forcing Clara to the negotiating table. It was a dirty, desperate move, and it was the final mistake Harper would ever make. Part 5. The Final Destruction and Liberation. The annual Global Marketing Summit in San Francisco was the most important event of the year for the industry. Thousands of CEOs, investors, and tech journalists gathered in the massive convention center. Harper Hayes had managed to keep her keynote speaking slot, booked months before the Apex crisis began. She walked onto the main stage wearing a white power suit, her face heavily contoured to hide the dark circles of sleepless nights. She was there to pivot. She was there to sell the audience a lie, that Apex was restructuring, that the rumors of bankruptcy were false, and that the AI platform Nexa was built on stolen data and unstable leadership. "The future of marketing," Harper declared into the microphone, her voice echoing through the cavernous hall, "cannot be trusted to rogue algorithms managed by unstable individuals. Apex has always stood for integrity." She didn't get to finish the sentence. The massive LED screen behind her, displaying the Apex logo, suddenly flickered. The logo vanished. The sound system emitted a sharp, high-frequency tone that silenced the crowd. Then a voice echoed through the hall. It wasn't Harper's. It was the voice of David Vance, the former owner of Lighthouse Media. "Harper, you can't just liquidate 40 jobs 2 weeks before Christmas. It's unethical." The crowd gasped. It was a recording. Harper whipped around, staring at the screen in absolute horror. "Cut the audio!" she screamed to the sound booth. "Cut it now!" But the sound booth had been locked out. Nexa's system had overridden the venue's network. Harper's own voice played next, crisp and arrogant, recorded during a phone call she had made to a rival agency months ago. "Ethics are for poor people, David. I'm stripping Lighthouse for parts. The board loves the margins. If the employees cry, tell them to buy a helmet." A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience of 3,000 people. Investors exchanged shocked glances. Journalists frantically began typing on their laptops. On the massive screen behind Harper, documents began to appear. They weren't rumors. They were hard, undeniable data. Apex marketing, internal audit, debt-to-income ratio, fatal, unpaid vendor invoices, $12.4 million, pending lawsuits for contract fraud, 14. The screen flashed again, displaying the exact loan agreement Harper had signed with Nexa, showing that she had leveraged the entire agency on a gamble. It was absolute, irrefutable proof that Apex was completely insolvent and that Harper Hayes was a fraud. From the side of the stage, a figure emerged from the shadows. Clara Hayes walked into the spotlight. She wasn't wearing a power suit. She was wearing a simple, elegant black dress. She looked completely at peace. The crowd fell dead silent as the mysterious, billionaire founder of Nexa finally revealed herself to the industry. Harper stumbled backward, her microphone dropping to the stage with a deafening screech of feedback. She looked at her younger sister not as a sibling, but as an executioner. Clara didn't pick up a microphone. She didn't need to speak to the crowd. She simply walked over to the podium, looked Harper directly in the eye, and pressed a single button on the console she carried. The screen behind them changed one last time. It displayed a live counter of Apex Marketing's stock price. As the journalists in the room hit publish on the leaked audio and audits, the stock line plummeted. It didn't just drop. It nosedived into oblivion. Within 60 seconds, trading on Apex was halted. The company was dead. "You did this," Harper sobbed, sinking to her knees on the stage, her white suit trembling. The cameras in the audience flashed relentlessly, capturing the spectacular downfall of the Golden Child. "You ruined me." Clara looked down at her. "No, Harper, I just turned on the lights. You ruined yourself." Clara turned and walked off the stage, leaving her sister kneeling in the ashes of her own empire. The fallout was biblical. Apex Marketing filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy the following Monday. Harper's assets were frozen, her Manhattan penthouse seized by creditors. But the tragedy of the Hayes family did not end there. In a desperate secret attempt to save Harper's company before the summit, Richard and Eleanor had quietly taken out a massive second mortgage on the Connecticut estate, funneling the money into Apex's accounts. When Apex collapsed, the money vanished. 2 months later, the bank foreclosed on the Hayes family home. The antique clock, the gold-rimmed china, the manicured lawns, all of it was auctioned off to satisfy the debts. The toxic family dynamic, entirely dependent on money and status, finally turned inward. Having no one else to blame, they devoured each other. Richard blamed Eleanor for spoiling Harper. Eleanor blamed Richard for making the bad investments. Harper, living in a cheap rental apartment and facing federal inquiries, screamed at her parents, blaming them for raising her to believe she was invincible. They were left with nothing but each other, and they found they couldn't stand the sight of one another. Thousands of miles away, in Seattle, it was raining. Clara Hayes sat in her penthouse office. The city lights glittered below her, reflecting in the dark glass. The office was quiet. She opened her phone. She navigated to her contacts list. She found the names: Richard, Eleanor, Harper. She had spent 28 years trying to earn their love, and 4 years building an empire to prove she didn't need it. But looking at the names now, she felt no anger. She felt no lingering desire for revenge. She felt weightless. She tapped the screen. Delete contact. Delete contact. Delete contact. Clara set the phone face down on the desk. She picked up her cup of tea, turned her chair toward the window, and watched the ferries cut through the dark water. The storm was over, and for the first time in her life, the silence wasn't lonely. It was just peace.